Why do people hate me?
Well, they don't hate you, just like the idea of you.
So it's not the things that I do, it is who I am?
No, well, actually, yeah, it is sort of. Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, Title Update 3 for Monster Hunter Wilds has been quite monumental in a number of ways. But the main one that I want to talk about today is, of course, Omega and Savage Omega, but in the specific context of it being a raid fight in Monster Hunter. This is now the second time that we have had a full monster crossover collaboration with Final Fantasy, and the second time that we've had what is essentially a raid fight translated into Monster Hunter combat, which is such a unique experience compared to pretty much every other monster fight in the series, and there was plenty of discussion about whether raid-style fights have a place in Monster Hunter, all the way back with the original edition of Behemoth as a crossover back in Monster Hunter World, and parts and pieces of that fight and that experience did actually stick around in the game, continuing to be implemented into later fights that were added. We'll talk about those in themselves and how the series has been changed as a result of this first experience, but the bulk of what I want to talk about today is Savage Omega specifically, why it works for some people, why it doesn't work for others, why it feels really unique in the context of a Monster Hunter game, why it's so polarizing on the whole, with some people who love a fight like this, and simultaneously there are plenty of people who absolutely hate it. And I don't think it's raw difficulty or challenge the same way that a lot of people think it is. And yet, through all of that, Monster Hunter Wilds is having a much larger player boom than it had with Title Update 2, even with the sort of completely opposing feelings about the update from a large portion of the player base. It's not necessarily that there's a larger number of players returning right now, but the actual retention rate of those players is much higher. There's a lot more people playing the game 3 days after this update than there were 3 days after Title Update 2, same with 4 days, same with 5 days. There are plenty of potential reasons for that, and plenty of possible things you could take from it, but the main thing is, I would say, is that it shows that something like Omega and Savage Omega have captured the attention span of players for longer than Title Update 2 did. The obvious way to interpret that would be to say that people really like Title Update 3 more than Title Update 2, and so they are playing it for a longer period of time as a result. I'm not saying that's inherently incorrect, but I do think there's a lot more to it than that specifically, because there's also the simple fact that Monster Hunter players tend to be very stubborn, and you probably just responded, "No, I'm not," because you're a Monster Hunter player. That same energy is what lets us spend hundreds of hours grinding these same monsters for RNG equipment that minorly increases the power of our builds. That's the same energy that makes us refuse to leave any monster unhunted. Whether we actually enjoy the moment-to-moment combat of the hunt or not, plenty of people will refuse to stop trying until they have defeated it, and Savage Omega is the prime current example of this in Monster Hunter Wilds, the hardest hunt in the game. I know plenty of people who both say that they hate this fight and still continue to do it on repeat because they haven't beaten it yet, and even some people who have beat it say they hate it and still fight it. That said, people are paying attention to this update and to this fight, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about the community feelings on Omegas. We already have a whole video on that topic. Instead, I more want to focus on the raid fight concept as a whole, whether it fits in Monster Hunter, and whether any of the more unique parts of this could reasonably be expected to return in other new fights that come to Wilds down the line. That said, the big thing to talk about is the concept of what makes this different from a normal Monster Hunter monster, and why it works extremely well at what it's doing. The first thing to keep in mind is that this is not the same as having like any random new monster that was invented for specifically Monster Hunter Wilds. It is very specifically, very intentionally, purposefully, a crossover monster, a collaboration monster that is originally from Final Fantasy. Specifically, the version that we've got is a raid boss from the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV, which does have a free trial. As someone with a bit of a background in MMO raiding, Josh did share this clip when he talked about Extreme Behemoth back in the day, but this is him leading the raid group that included me as the main take through a server-first mythic boss kill in World of Warcraft. For a load of you, that sentence will have made no sense at all, doesn't mean anything to you, whatever. But those who do know will be able to confirm that it means we probably have a little bit of experience with MMO raid mechanics, and it's one of those things that we bonded over a lot before I was ever part of a video on the channel that I now call home. Point being, I like raiding, I like MMOs, and that's an important thing to understand when you hear me talk about enjoying this fight, because Omega is absolutely intended to be a fairly faithful recreation and representation of the Final Fantasy raid fight within the context of Monster Hunter combat. One of the core design philosophies of Monster Hunter Hunter monsters is that they are a living, breathing, believable animal first above all, and then that animal is then turned into a boss. They decide the fight after they decide the animal. They create the creature as a creature, and then they ask themselves, how would this thing fight? And sure, sometimes they would add some bits to the designs to fit the fight that they want to end up going with, but the initial thought between every Monster Hunter monster is the creature first and foremost. With raid fights and MMOs, it's generally the opposite. The first thought is, what kind of mechanics do we want to create? How do we want to test the players? Then they make the boss around those types of things. And it's just a totally different sort of school of game design. On the same wavelength, the gameplay tends to reflect this. Because of this, in most fights and most situations in Monster Hunter, it is extremely free-form, free-flowing. If a monster does a telegraph showing you it's about to do a specific attack, you usually have like 8 different ways that you can deal with it. You can dodge it with iframes, you can move positionally out of the way ahead of time, you can block or parry if your weapon has those, you can hit the monster and hope to flinch it before the attack goes off, you can use items. One of the main iconic parts of Monster Hunter combat is how much choice the player has. Every player plays slightly differently from each other. Conversely to this, a raid boss mechanic is generally something that you either get correctly or you get incorrectly. And if you get it incorrectly, it usually leads to disastrous results, not just for you, but for a bunch of people around you as well. The thing is, this line has actually been blurred a bit over the last 7 years. And yes, it's crazy to say it's been 7 years, but this all started with the first time that Monster Hunter had an in-depth collaboration monster with an MMO, which also happened to be Final Fantasy XIV, with Behemoth, another raid fight. Ever since Behemoth, a number of mechanics that were never in Monster Hunter beforehand, but were a part of the Behemoth crossover fight, then were carried forward and became a part of certain higher tier monster fights added to the series afterwards. The enmity mechanic would return with things like ffxiv, and super attacks requiring a physical barrier of protection that you had to physically stand behind has been a thing that we've seen multiple times since Behemoth. But Behemoth was the first time that was in Monster Hunter, really, and I've never really heard people complaining about these styles of mechanic when they were brought back to enhance new actual proper monsters. And I think that's an interesting note in itself, is that while these raid-like mechanics where you have to do one very specific thing is the answer, they are a noticeable departure from most regular Monster Hunter combat. It's not like they don't fit in at all. It just depends how you use them, where you use them, and most importantly, how often you use them. And with that, let's get back to Omega. I would argue that Omega feels a lot less binary than Behemoth did mechanically, as ironic as that is to say about a literal robot creature, but Behemoth had a do this correct or be one-shot type mechanic that he did a handful of times through the quest, whereas Savage Omega only has one of those, with the Delta attack charge up DPS check phase, and you can technically complete the hunt even if you fail at that. It just becomes a fair bit harder to do so. You also don't have little baby comets that you have to protect for the sake of your own safety, or tornadoes that you have to place carefully, though Muster Bomb does work quite similarly in practice. It picks a target, then creates an area of pain under their feet a few seconds afterwards. Where this fight really differentiates itself, though, is that these types of mechanics are a bit more spread out. They are less common. Behemoth, 5 or 6 out of 10 attacks were like a raid mechanic. Then sometimes he would do like normal bites or hip checks or regular Monster Hunter-y combat stuff. Omega feels like he leans way more on the other side of things. He's much more regular attacks. It's just that his regular attacks are wild and unlike regular monsters. Like he has a 4-direction fire breath, or he has the ability to fire a position tracking laser beam strong enough to nearly one-shot most players, or he's got a full frontal cone laser that has minimal telegraph time before it begins. All of these things are pretty unlike Monster Hunter, but they still do fit. He is a tough fight, even from the normal monster hunting side of things, before we even talk about raid mechanics. But then he does also have things like an enmity mechanic. He has Mustard Bomb, which you have to actively deal with and place smartly. He has the Merv Missile, the shields, and even Pantocrator mode is very raid-like. It's meant to embody a sort of DPS check phase, except instead of a DPS check, it is instead a wound damage check, where you have to target specifically the legs and move to a new leg after wounding the previous one. And then of course the actual proper DPS check phase in the third phase, where you get 90 seconds to destroy an Ursula or your whole party gets blasted. Overall, I would say the ratio is much further away from the pure raid mechanic feeling attacks, and yet it still feels undeniably like a raid fight to me. It feels more like Monster Hunter than Behemoth did, but also, in some ways, more like a raid. First, the creature itself. It's a robot. I mean, it's not a monster. It doesn't move like a monster, and that means its attack patterns can function totally differently to a realistic creature. There is no feasible monster design in the series series that could justify firing out a fire breath from 4 cardinal directions at the same time, then turning a little bit and blasting the other 4 remaining save spots immediately afterwards. That is a raid attack. That is not a monster attack. It is super unique to something like Omega, and it feels like it fits in this raid style fight. Even though it is something that you can have those freeform avoidance options with, like you can iframe the flames, you can move out of the way of the flames, you can block the flames, but the attack pattern itself, the speed, the size, the shape of it, it feels like a raid mechanic, and that is true of a ton of the attacks he does. Things like how the rocket punch can be slapped out of the air before it hits you so you can destroy it first. That's very much not something that happens in Monster Hunter, but it still feels very good once you get the hang of it because it gives you more options, not less options, more options. Monster Hunter's free-flowing action combat is generally a very opposing style to the sort of checkbox yes or no answers that you often have with raid mechanics. They aren't easy genres to mix together properly, and I think they did a great job with Behemoth 7 years ago, but I'd argue that Omega, and especially Savage Omega, do an even better job of mixing those styles now. It feels more like Monster Hunter than Behemoth did, but at the same time, I have seen so many comments from Final Fantasy players saying this is a super faithful recreation of the raid fight within Final Fantasy, so it seems like they managed to do something that was both more fitting to Monster Hunter and more fitting for being a Final Fantasy crossover, and I love that. All that said, the point here is the frequency of these raid-type mechanic attacks. Fatalis did have a raid-style mechanic in Iceborne, but he literally only had one of them, and he only did it a handful of times through the fight, and that is low enough frequency that you can enjoy the spectacle of the giant fire breaths he does without it taking away too much from that feeling like you're hunting an actual monster. Having 1 or 2 of these raid-like attacks or mechanics in an Elder Dragon level monster fight is not an issue in itself, so obviously that's not the problem. The difference is with these crossover fights, it's because they are directly being taken from an MMO raid fight, they are chock full of these binary MMO raid type mechanics. Savage Omega could very well have things that will eventually be added to proper Monster Hunter monsters in the future. We could have things like a Quematrice that summons a Devil Joe mid-hunt, and then you have a limited timer to hunt that Devil Joe before the Quematrice does something threatening. I don't know, maybe a Quematrice wasn't the best answer. Look, I haven't thought of the whole way through, but the point is, the first time Capcom brought raid mechanics to Monster Hunter through a crossover, it affected and inspired the way they designed powerful monsters moving forwards until this day. So this is almost like an opportunity for them to work within a side of game design they normally don't. They are building a monster that isn't inside of the same box that a monster normally is. As a result, they can see what works and what doesn't, and then continue to take inspiration from the raid-like stuff they think went well. It's like a smaller, more contained version of when they do a spin-off game. They do weird, funky things in the spin-off game, and they bring some of those spin-off game things into the main series. Like, I could totally see like a monster in the future that has a special mode that only stops when you pop a specific wound in a specific location, and that would obviously be inspired by Omega, but it's also totally believable as a singular function added to a proper Monster Hunter creature without the rest of the context. In other words, I think depending on your feelings towards MMOs in general, your enjoyment of these very sort of binary raid mechanics will vary, but I also think that when there are only a few of them in a fight, people barely notice. But if it's all over the fight, that causes a lot more divisiveness and a lot more disagreement between hunters around whether they actually like it or not. But there's also one big other main factor, which is other players. Omega is designed from the ground up for 4-player hunts. It can be fought solo, it can be beaten solo, and there are solo speedruns out there that make my 4-player kills look like they were done by 4 monkeys in a trench coat, but with even less cohesion than the monkeys would have. Unlike Behemoth in Monster Hunter World, Omega in Wilds even does have solo health scaling, so you aren't actively punished for fighting him solo in the same way, except for the fact that his moveset feels like it was designed for a group, and it's most notable during things like Pantocrator mode and during the final phase especially. There are a lot of attacks he has, especially during those parts, which will attack every player at once unless one player has enmity, in which case it only targets the person with enmity, which then leaves 3 people free to attack Omega and do damage. But if you are solo, if you're the only player, enmity or not, you will always be targeted by every attack, and there is very little downtime between the majority of his attacks in these moments. So when playing solo, it just feels pretty awful, honestly, in my personal opinion, but that brings us to groups. Arguably the most reliable choice, if you can trust in your own personal skill, is support hunters. These weren't a thing in Monster Hunter World for Behemoth, but they do exist now, and in the Omega hunt specifically, they're actually a pretty solid resource that you can use if you would otherwise be playing solo without them, as they do make the fight way more approachable. But Most people view things as either full solo or full proper multiplayer, and that's when you start to realize one of the other big things with MMO and raiding type fights, which is that sometimes things will go wrong and it's not your fault. Often things will go wrong and it's not your fault, and even though it's not your fault, you need to try again. Raiding is not about the skill of a singular player, it's about the skill of the whole group. Sometimes you can have a weaker player getting carried by a stronger player, but for the most part in high-end raid fights especially, if one person is lagging behind the others, you can tell pretty easily, and that's something that Savage Omega in particular brings out pretty well. I have seen so many posts or comments complaining about teammates dying, ending the run, or things like that, and the thing I love about that is that it makes it more of a raid fight. It brings genuine reasons to have a more dedicated tank-type player to take enmity, someone who mains Lance finally having a real role that people want them in their party to use, and it gives validation to support-type setups as well with wide range and free meal, and as someone who loves sword and shield support builds in Monster Hunter even regularly, the fact that my best hunts on Savage Omega have all been with support, sword and shield makes a lot of sense to me. Savage Omega when solo is a nightmare, but absolutely doable once you understand it yourself. Savage Omega with other players is the true raid-like experience. You are relying on yourself, of course, but you are relying on others at least as much, and you need to do your best to make life easier for every other player as well if you want to enhance your chances of success, and I love that. So all in all, Savage Omega absolutely feels like a raid boss to me. He feels more Monster Hunter-y than Behemoth did, even though he's like a literal alien robot creature thing instead of something that could be believable as an animal. But his general attacks, his movements, they're all pretty predictable after you've fought him a couple of times, and this makes the actual action combat component feel really good to me. It feels satisfying when you get it right. But also your success is equally dependent on every one of your party members, and while you can play solo or with support hunters, it just feels correct with 4-player controlled hunters. This fight does not feel like any other monster hunt in all of Wilds, but does that mean it's bad? That's entirely personal opinion. I like it, I think it's fun, and you're totally allowed to disagree with that, but I think it's good to understand why, and I think for most people, the answer is a mix of these raid-type mechanics with more binary solutions, and the need to rely on other players instead of yourself. Some people like that kind of thing, some people don't. It's undeniably very much different from standard Monster Hunter formula, but it's such a unique thing. 2 Final Fantasy collaboration crossover monsters, and 2 of the most unique fights not just in the Monster Hunter series, but there are few, if any, games that can capture this mix of action melee combat and well-made raid mechanics. And I love that I get to have that experience inside of Monster Hunter, even if it isn't the thing that Monster Hunter does consistently. Sure, it isn't the same as having like an actual new Monster Hunter creature added to the game, but it is one of the most unique things in all of gaming, as far as I'm concerned, and I love that we get to experience that as Monster Hunter fans, whether you actually like the fight itself or not. The experience is special, and you just can't really get it anywhere else. Title Update 3 is polarizing as hell, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I love what we got. A lot of people think it's the raw difficulty that's causing the disagreements in the community, but I personally think it's more where the difficulty comes from, which is binary mechanics and a reliance on other players. If there was a change of direction for the entire future of the series because of this, I can understand being upset about it, but it's a very purposeful and intentional crossover monster. Future monsters won't be like Omega. They might take bits and pieces of them in very small amounts, but this isn't like what the future of Monster Hunter is, it's just a special moment in time that we get to experience. Is it a great Monster Hunter monster? That's super debatable. Is it a great example of an MMO raid fight ported into a Monster Hunter combat style? Absolutely, top to bottom, from the inside out, yes, full stop, yes. That just about does it for today, everyone. A discussion about Omega and Savage Omega and everything I find interesting about what is now becoming a pattern of Monster Hunter collaborations with Final Fantasy, resulting in super high-effort, interesting fights. I recognize that this thing is not everyone's cup of tea, but it totally is mine, and I wanted to talk about why, and what my thoughts are on the general community response to. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and of course let me know your own thoughts on all this down in the comment section below as well. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. is goodbye.